Hi, I'm Pastor Gary, and welcome back to Church in the World this seventh Sunday. The seventh week of Easter. The seventh Sunday of Easter was yesterday, where we finished out week 6 with an appendix. And this is week 7, which will conclude on the day of Pentecost, which is this coming Sunday, which is the 50th day of Easter and the 8th Sunday, the last day of the season of Easter. And that's important to know because that means that we're winding down this series. We only have 2 social statements from the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, left. One of them will start today, and we'll have 3 videos on that, and that's the church and criminal justice hearing their cries. And the final statement will be on women, justice, and sexism. And that will be starting 3 videos from now. So this video is a 3-parter on criminal justice, and then another 3-parter on women and justice, and then we'll wrap up with an appendix on the day of Pentecost. So, the Church and Criminal Justice Hearing the Cries was adopted on August 17th, 2013 in Pittsburgh at the 30th Biennial Churchwide Assembly of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. So, this is from 2013. That's important to know because I'm recording this in 2021, and that's over a year after the murder of George Floyd. And I do call it a murder because it was ruled to be a murder in court, and someone was convicted of that murder. So that's what that was. And while some people, in fact, a lot of people across the world and certainly in the country, were shocked at what happened on video camera in that example, an awful lot of people also weren't. And so we're going to talk about why, and why especially people who were involved in or knew about this social statement already knew that there was something deeply wrong in the criminal justice system here in the United States of America. So let's get to it. In this first video, we're going to talk, if you've got the document open, which there's a link down in the description if you want to follow along. In the first video, we'll talk about the introduction and assessing the system. In the second part, we'll do justice and yearning and wise responses of love. That's sections 3 and 4. And then from 5 all the way to the conclusions at 8 will be the third video in this series. So follow along as you're able. We're starting with the overview very briefly. And this is a short paragraph. It's worth reading in total. The Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the ELCA, affirms the fundamental principles of the U.S. criminal justice system, such as due process of law and the presumption of legal innocence. Yet this church hears people's cries that reflect the current system's serious deficiencies. Drawing from the biblical witness to God's wondrously rich forms of love and justice, we are compelled by a holy yearning to address the need for a change in the public mindset and for dramatic reforms in policies and practices. This statement calls upon Christians to strengthen or take up ministries of compassion and justice. Drawing on evidence and data, it affirms some current efforts at improving the system while identifying numerous other reforms that urgently need implementation. Okay? So we're starting with already an understanding that something is wrong in the criminal justice system. But hopefully the statement, for those of you who might be suspicious of this, the statement will give us some justification. We're going to move by the summary of key points. That's really useful on page 3 and 4. I hope that you'll avail yourself of that. If you want to, you can pause the video right now and kind of get your head around what the statement's going to go through. But we're going to go through the meat of the statement. The introduction, then. It talks about the state in which the statement was made, which is not terribly different from the time of talking. As the statement is adopted, 1 in 34 adults in the United States is under some form of correctional control, and more citizens are imprisoned as a percentage of the population than in any other country on earth, even those with comparable crime rates. The United States spends $60 billion every year for corrections alone, and they who work in the criminal justice system often feel stressed to the breaking point. People of color and people living in poverty are disproportionately harmed by problems within the system. Concerned that so many cries from victims, the incarcerated, their families, communities, those wrongly convicted, those who work in the system, have not been heard. The ELCA is prompted to speak and act. As members of the body of Christ and as citizens who seek to strengthen communities, we, as the ELCA, are both freed and called in Christ to serve the needs of the neighbor and to work for justice and peace in all the world. That language is directly from the baptismal rite in the ELCA, found in your Evangelical Lutheran Worship hymnal, if that's near to hand. You can find it directly in there. Let's see here. Oh, I lost my piece because of my hymnal reference. Here we go. Seeking God's just will for the world requires continual theological and moral discernment and deliberation. As in 1991 or 1994, when the ELCA addressed questions about the death penalty. We actually did that very early in the series. I believe it was the second week of this series. We talked about the death penalty social statement. So go see that, and you'll see a lot of what this statement will say foreshadowed in that statement. It's very clearly interconnected problems. Or causes of crime, and that was a social message, I believe, in 1994, which is a little different from a social statement, but you can find that at the ELCA website. This statement is the product of such seeking and an invitation both to ongoing discernment and to action for the sake of our neighbors. The ELCA speaks in this statement from among and to its members, to those affected by crime in any way, and to those who work for the public good in various civil offices related to the criminal justice system. Drawing from Holy Scripture, this church holds up a vision of God's justice that is wondrously richer and deeper than human efforts, and yet is a gauge against which justice in this world, God's world, must always be assessed. Amos 5. So we're aware then, this is the shape of the controversy, right? We are aware that there's something wrong with the criminal justice system. This is kind of just assumed by this statement. The level of incarceration, the stresses within the criminal justice system, both on victims, on offenders, on families, on persons who are employed, on persons who serve in criminal justice, all of these things are stressed, right? And that is an indication of a systemic problem, right? Something that has fundamentally gone wrong. And that's the statement here on criminal justice is going to assume that we understand that that's what we're talking about here. We're not talking about, for example, one bad apple. This statement has no interest in prosecuting one bad apple, whatever that means. Rather, this statement is interested in a systemic flaw that is an error or problem within the policies and practices. So it's not a matter of a cop ignoring policy. That's going to happen, presumably, no matter what. There should be consequences for it. But what we're concerned about is cops police officers being wrongly equipped and placed in a system that is so inherently broken that even those of goodwill have difficulty enacting goodwill, right? And then of course we can talk about correctional officers and institutions and all sorts of stuff like this, but that's an example of the problem, right? We're not talking about addressing bad conduct by individuals. We're talking about a systemic problem, something that is routinely churning out results we don't want to see. And that indicates a problem that is beyond the individual, right? That's systemic. That's what I mean by systemic. And so this statement devotes significant attention to reform and calls for a dramatic shift in public discussion about criminal justice. The dominant public view underlying the current system equates more punitive measures with more just ones. In other words, the harsher the punishment, the better justice is served, right? Oh, justice is served because X person got the death penalty or life imprisonment. What makes that justice? We just kind of assume that harsh penalties are better, right? For criminals, for people who have committed crimes. Why? The limited success of massive incarceration in deterring crime has not affected the prevalence of lock 'em all up rhetoric in public debate. This is another thing, and this is something that I remember the Clinton administration pushing when I was fairly young. This notion that we're going to incarcerate more and more people and that will deter crime. Very limited evidence that that's actually working, certainly not on the scale that kind of was assumed at that time as far as I understood it. Prevalent views such as tough on crime rhetoric and policies make it more difficult to see each person involved in the criminal justice system as a human being. These views effectively override the conviction that all people are created in the image of God and worthy of appropriate, compassionate responses. A punitive mindset hinders questioning the logic and practices of the current system and limits efforts to seek better alternatives. The church knows human evil is prevalent, ancient, and often heinous. News reports about murders, white-collar crime, political corruption, sexual assault, to name just a few, provide almost daily reminders of this human propensity. The criminal justice system will move toward greater effectiveness overall and toward greater rendering of justice, only when undergirded by a mindset that recognizes each person as a valued human being and a member of human communities. This statement thus recognizes the need for changes in mindset and policies. It urges a clear-eyed and humane perspective that can undergird effective long-term reform. It urges reform supported by data and attentive both to individual and social good that provides appropriate and flexible measures of response to criminality in place of stringent and sweeping measures of incarceration. Right? So what have we said here thus far? The point of the criminal justice system is not to prevent or correct or stop evil for all time. The criminal justice system can't do that. Okay, that's a divine action, not a human one. But the criminal justice system can move towards greater effectiveness and greater rendering towards justice if we change the following things. This is what the introduction is saying. 1, treat every human being as a human being, right? And 2, amend our policies in such a way that reflects this, right? Reforms supported by data and attentive to individual and social good, right? Appropriate and flexible measures of response to criminality, right? Why? Because we've seen that being obsessed with punishment doesn't work. It's not helping. In fact, it's creating whole new problems. But we're the church, and we have to start with the church. So in section A, we have confession. This church and its members do not pretend we are guiltless regarding either crime or the problems of criminal justice. Many Christians confess each week we have sinned in thought, word, and deed, by what we have done and by what we have left undone. To confess one's sins centers accountability and can lead both to the truth being told and justice being done, 1 John 1. In confession, God is invoked as the one who brings to human brokenness the fullness of new life. In that spirit, we are called to confess that the church and its members have fallen short in responding to the growing problems of the justice system. We ourselves sometimes have committed crimes. Often we have been negligent or allowed fear or bias to dictate responses to crime. Often we have allowed the cries of those harmed or those who work in the system to go unheard. Often we have been complacent as the burdens of crime and the criminal justice system are borne unfairly, especially by people of color or people living in poverty. In confessing complicity in injustice, this church invokes both the judgment and the wise guidance of God. We turn to God for counsel on how we might minister better and more mercifully to those harmed by injustice. We ask God's aid in opening our hearts to the cries of our neighbors, that their faces and voices might show us whom we must love if we say we love God. 1 John 4. We pray for guidance to speak more prophetically and to strive more responsibly toward earthly justice, right? Now, this is a confession then that the church has failed to be church in the way that we're called to be, and that we're repenting and moving, hopefully, in a more faithful direction. That's what confession always is for everyone. If you're not part of the Lutheran denomination or you're not familiar with this explanation, this might kind of surprise you. Confession is not about getting back into God's good graces so that you can get to heaven. Confession is about amending our lives because we recognize that we have broken our relationships, our healthy relationships with ourselves, our neighbor, and our God, okay, all of which are combined, right? Because we can't have a healthy relationship with God without a healthy relationship with our neighbors, right? When we fail to love our neighbor, that is because we have failed to love God, right? So for Christians, there's no separation. And that's again in 1 John, as this statement points out. If you've been following along with the lectionary, this is year B in the lectionary year cycle. And that means that we've heard a lot of 1 John in the second readings throughout the season of Easter. 1 John is an excellent letter. I do commend it to you. Okay, so this confession is a mark of the church. It's one of the 7 indicators Luther called a mark of the church. It illustrates the fundamental character and practices of the church. Another such mark is compassionate suffering, an external mark whereby the Holy Spirit sanctifies the church in relationship to the neighbor. These marks of the church serve throughout the statement as critical indicators of genuinely Christian responses to today's criminal justice system and to the people involved in it, right? So remember, This is not a public policy thing by the Democratic or Republican parties or anything like that. It's not even a neutral policy statement by a nonpartisan study. This is a church document. It's about Christians, right? And so when you argue with this, or if you want to argue with this, you have to argue based on Christian principles and Christian confessions and Christian theology. You can't just say, well, that's importing religion. Well, of course it is. Christians are talking. We don't have a distinction between how we do our politics and how we conceive of God and humanity. Like, what would that even mean? So we're going to move on to part 2, assessing the system, right? So we recognize that we have a real serious civil governance problem, right? In the Lutheran confessions and consistent with them, we teach that civil government is a gift from God for the purpose of creating laws, prescribing punishment for laws upon adequate proof of guilt, and maintaining the laws and the systems that they create, right? Their purpose is to protect the social fabric, to provide for the wider social good, to prevent harm to all. Because an effective system of criminal justice is an essential part of any functioning civil government, we affirm the legitimacy of the U.S. criminal justice system in the sense that there needs to be such a thing, and the fundamental principles to which the system is committed. Among others, these include the rights to counsel and against self-incrimination, protection against illegal search and seizure, trial by jury, and the presumption of legal innocence. By the way, you'll notice that some of those are rights that the government just kind of occasionally stops extending to certain groups of people. Yeah, that's because that's a corruption of governmental responsibility, right? So what we're saying is it's important for there to be some level of civil governance, and for there to be laws, and for there to be rights that citizens have, and for the government to respect those rights and enforce those laws, right? And to amend those laws such that justice is furthered, right, when necessary. This church joins its voice with many others who recognize grave deficiencies in the current system of criminal justice. Conflicting political objectives, budgetary demands, distorted media portrayals, and persistent inequalities based on race, ethnicity, gender, and class frequently challenge the system's implementation of, and perhaps even its commitment to, the basic principles of justice. The failure to achieve a well-ordered system of criminal justice imposes grievous costs on everyone involved in the system and on society as a whole. The most just and enduring solutions for reform will be built upon realistic perspectives about crime that recognize the humanity of all those involved in the criminal justice system and that follow principled and evidence-supported practices. Guided by these commitments, our assessment attends to careful description based on the principles of justice and takes into account the cries of those participating in the system. Each participant is a human being with dignity who deserves to be heard. And so the rest of this statement is going to be, the rest of this section will mostly be coming from different people who interface with the criminal justice system in some way or another, and what their concerns or cries are, right? And I think that's really valuable. I'm going to try to go quickly here because I'm already running late, but I want you to hear this. It's very important. First, victims of crime. On the whole, it's correct to say that all crime does harm. Some is immediate, some is delayed, some is moderate impact, some carries dramatic, lifelong consequences. The harm can be physical, emotional, financial, varying combinations. But crime always tears at the personal and social trust that undergirds the flourishing of human society, and yet victims of crime bear the most immediate injury. Much in the current system presumes conviction and punishment delivered through a principled, depersonalized institution is an adequate response to the social need for justice. In many cases, this may be true, but human beings are involved. Victims of crime whose needs largely have been ignored in the past by depersonalized institutions focused solely on punishment cry out for something more. We affirm the need for increased attention to the rights, needs, and interests of victims in the criminal justice system. Those who are harmed by crime deserve consideration and respect throughout the process of adjudicating justice. In appropriate circumstances, a greater resonance of justice and humanity may be achieved when forms of personal interchange are practiced, such as financial restitution or opportunities for dialogue when sought by both victim and perpetrator. So what are we saying here? We're saying, remember, this is the United States of America, right? this statement starting out with, okay, let's talk about the victims. Are the victims always well served by the criminal justice system? Turns out not really, right? Turns out just punishing the person who perpetrated the crime doesn't always meet the need and respect the human dignity of the victim. We're not even talking about all the other persons that are going to be involved yet, right? So clearly something has fractured. Then we talk about law enforcement. We give thanks for those who serve in law enforcement with dedication to the common good. Federal, state, county, and local law enforcement officers daily confront troubles ranging from murder to domestic violence to missing pets. We recognize that those who serve regularly encounter complex and stressful situations that take a toll on their lives and relationships. By the way, it's another indicator that something's wrong. It also must be acknowledged that the reputation of law enforcement has been stained by evidence of racial bias and excessive use of force. District attorneys, prosecutors, and related staff as members of the law enforcement also serve for the purpose of administering justice, maintaining order, and protecting the public order, and protecting the social fabric. We are troubled by evidence of bias and other shortcomings worsened by overwhelming caseloads, even while honoring those who, through their service, strive to operate with fairness and human care. We affirm ongoing efforts to deal with stresses in the system and efforts to train and support members of the law enforcement system in constructively responding to bias and abuse, right? So already we're naming, okay, there's clearly there's evidence of racial bias, excessive use of force among law enforcement officers. Then with the DAs, prosecutors, and related staff, there's very clearly an overload in the system, evidence of bias. The overload worsens the bias. It's just easier to behave in a biased way when you're stressed, and we tend to do that. That's human nature. And so we realize that the people who are involved with law enforcement are being harmed by the judicial system, by the criminal justice system. What about the judicial system? Well, we give thanks for that system, intended to operate with impartiality and accuracy in handling offenses, while also being structured to provide legal protection against errors or overreach by the state. A just system is appropriately responsive to claimed violations of rights of person or property and treats all participants with equal respect. A system of fair adjudication for disputed questions of fact and law provides transparent processes and appropriate opportunity for review of decisions. To achieve these goals, a fair system would ensure the accused have meaningful access to legal counsel, fair notice of the charges and opportunity to challenge and present evidence. It would provide protection of legal rights by an independent judge, adjudication of factual disputes by an impartial judge or jury, and access to appellate review of trial court decisions. A judicial system depends on the good faith and competent performance of all who serve vocations in the criminal justice system, including judges, prosecutors, defense counsel, and court personnel. We affirm the responsibility of citizens to serve on juries. Achievement of these goals depends on adequate resources, but in many places, the adjudicative process faces an overwhelming number of cases. If you ever had to go to court for a traffic ticket, right, or for some sort of other misdemeanor, something that really you're just going to get a fine, you know this. You see how they're churning through cases left and right because they have this gigantic caseload numbers because there aren't enough places where they're handled, right? Relative to the size of the population. This high volume is also due largely to current national drug policy and zero tolerance policies for certain public order offenses, and it leaves little opportunity for particularized attention to any case. Overwhelming caseloads also mean the vast majority of cases must be resolved by negotiated pleas. While there are social and personal benefits from negotiated resolutions, this now common practice of private negotiations between prosecutors and defense attorneys may be less transparent than what happens in courtroom trials where communications and decisions are a matter of public record. Over the past generation, the adjudicative process has been significantly affected by changes to sentencing policies. Such changes responded to concerns that judicial discretion in sentencing produced unacceptable variation among punishments for the same offenses. We affirm the importance of equal treatment in sentencing, but we express concern that sentencing reform has become synonymous with increasingly harsher sentences. So far, we've talked about, and we're not even done. We're not even actually to the offenders. I don't know if we even get there. No, we will. We will talk about offenders in one breath with corrections, right? So you see the depth of the problem here. Now, since crime is inevitable, so too is the need for appropriate consequences, which require offenders to reckon with the fact that their crime has caused harm and must be addressed. Right? In kindergarten, when I ripped a doll apart, I had to go sit in the corner. Right? Genuine disagreement exists regarding the rationale for the forms punishment should take. Deterrence, rehabilitation, incapacitation, retribution, and restoration are all plausible justifications for punishment. Punishing offenders may serve as a deterrent to their reoffending in the future, specific deterrence, or to others who might commit a similar crime, general deterrence. Punishing offenders might serve rehabilitative needs. The offenders are equipped to understand the harms they have caused and help to become a person less likely to offend. Another justification for punishment is incapacitation. When an offender seems significantly likely to re-offend and the offense would do significant harm, the offender must be prevented from harming again. I mean, this is kind of obvious stuff, but you want to stop this from repeating. This may also have aspects of retribution in which there is a legitimate concern for rebalancing a ruptured social order. In this way of thinking, if a human being has inflicted pain or gained an unfair advantage, he or she should experience proportional pain and have the advantage removed. And finally, there is restoration. Advocates of restorative justice suggest that victims, offenders, and their families and communities would be better served when, in cases of admitted guilt and where the personal and emotional safety of victims is protected, resolution takes place in a facilitated conversation among these parties. Such practices have been especially useful in juvenile justice and in adult cases of property crime where both victim and offender willingly participate. No singular rationale or practice of punishment is solely commendable, right? None of these things can be the whole ball of wax. Deterrent strategies may make society safer, but they risk treating individuals solely as the means to an end of crime reduction. Retribution speaks to an innate human desire to have the punishment fit the crime, but it can easily devolve into mere vengeance. Rehabilitation and restoration so promise to mend ruptured relationships between people and attend to the needs of victims and offenders, but they can reach beyond what the state is able or rightly mandated to achieve, right? You can't command people to forgive one another. Reliance on one particular form of punishment or another may be appropriate in a given case, and human reason rightly employed can discern what is best. No single form of punishment, however, is required of necessity, and this includes incarceration. This is simply one strategy among many, even though it has become the one overwhelmingly chosen by the United States. The recognition that incarceration is merely one option among many brings freedom to challenge the logic of mass incarceration and enables imagining and instituting better alternatives. Although justified in principle, all practices of punishment deserve serious scrutiny. As noted, the U.S. has the highest incarceration in the world. This has led to both overcrowding and very significant expenditures on prisons, tax dollars that could justifiably be better spent elsewhere. Massive overcrowding contributes considerably to the dehumanizing problems in the prison system. Inmates fear physical and sexual violence from each other and staff, and worry about threats of future violence if reported. Gangs often control the culture of prisons. Inmates are powerless in interactions with correctional staff, some of whom degrade inmates through language and physical intimidation. All inmates experience despair from lack of control and inexpressible loneliness from separation. Massive overcrowding today worsens conditions to the point of inhumane treatment of the incarcerated. Dangers to physical safety are real, and declining health through poor conditions is likely. Cost-saving measures have caused some governments to contract with private firms to incarcerate offenders, raising many ethical questions. A contributing factor to inhumane conditions involves the increased proportion of the mentally ill in jails and prison. Currently, well over half of the population. As the institutionalized mental illness population of the U.S. has been reduced by more than 80% over recent decades, many of those released have ended up homeless or in prisons. This is something I can speak to from experience. Asbury Park, New Jersey, was a place where, when a whole variety of institutions closed in the 80s, the mentally ill folks who were in those institutions full time were literally bussed into Asbury Park and dropped off. The end. That is not humane, and it is unacceptable. And the reason that happened was because of Christians who voted that way, because Christians are still the majority of the voting bloc, at least nominally, and certainly were in the 80s. Christians voted that way. We supported those kinds of policies. I have no words for the level of, I have no words for the suffering that I've seen that policy wreak. And it's been well over 30 years. And I know people who have wandered the streets ever since, desperate to find a place to live, desperate to find help, but unable to, partially because of the illness. That was why they were in an institution. Anyway, imprisonment is not therapeutic by nature. Placement in jails and prisons has the effect of criminalizing mental illness and puts the mentally ill at risk for exploitation by other inmates. The incarceration of those with special needs without sufficient services contributes considerably to prison volatility, right? Prisons aren't designed for people experiencing mental illness. That's not what they're there for. That's not even in their purpose. The ELCA has addressed the needs of people living with mental illness and noted problems related to the incarcerated in the 2012 social message, The Body of Christ and Mental Illness. So you can go read that if you like. Clearly, I care a lot about this particular part. Related to all these mass incarcerated rates is the troubling emergence of much more punitive attitudes to the incarcerated. As the population grows, services are being greatly reduced or eliminated, such as educational and recreational opportunities or access to counseling and spiritual care. As people of reason, we accept differences in correctional philosophies, but as people of faith, we reject dehumanization of the incarcerated through brutalizing means, whether legal, psychological, sexual, emotional, racial, cultural, or spiritual. While rational people may reasonably disagree about the extent and sources of suffering, this church insists that some of its forms simply must stop. So here's where we get to brass tacks. Here are things that we insist must end in the United States of America. These things include widespread and long-term total isolation and solitary confinement. Okay? Incarceration practices that sever family ties. Trying, sentencing, and incarcerating children in the adult system. Collateral sanctions that make social reintegration extremely difficult, and severely limited access to education, counseling, and mental illness treatment, substance abuse treatment, and vocational training. Right? Now think about this. I know this is a long video, but this is a really important topic for all of us. Imagine a criminal justice system that had just stopped these things, right? Imagine a criminal justice system where familial ties were not severed by incarceration, where total isolation was short-term at the most and generally was not used, where trying, sentencing, and incarcerating children in the adult system stopped, where collateral sanctions stopped so that social reintegration was more easy, more facilitated, where there was higher access in the prisons to education, counseling, mental illness treatments, and substance abuse treatment, and vocational training. If we need to say that in prisons people should be able to be educated, receive counseling, receive treatment for mental illness, receive substance abuse treatment, and vocational training, then what on earth is being done in prisons? What is being done to help those people? What is being done to equip them and heal them at all? If that access is that limited, what is the point of the prison? They're not learning anything, right? Or very rarely are learning anything. They're not receiving counseling or treatment for disorders or illnesses. They're not receiving training. So what are they doing? As the statement's already alluded to, they're forming relationships with other criminals, and generally, if they're not in a gang when they go in, they're in a gang by the time they get out. How does that serve justice? Oh, and then there's the thing you thought we were going to skip by. Racism. The ELCA has long recognized that racism pervasively infects and affects all aspects of the United States society. Racism is central to the deep and abiding problems of the current criminal justice system, even though often unacknowledged. The extent to which inequality exists within the system through biased enforcement, adjudication, and treatment remains a matter on which further discernment is needed within the Church and the society. It is fair to note, however, that such disparities may favor socially privileged groups that, because of this favor, often do not feel their privilege or understand its reach. The criminal justice system encounters citizens in a long sequence, beginning with law enforcement officers and moving through many stages: release on bond, assignment of counsel, arraignment, adjudication of the offense, sentencing and punishment, including sometimes incarceration, probation or intermediate sanctions. While racial disparities at any one particular point in the sequence may be small, and intentional discrimination may even be absent, right? It may not be that anyone intends for this to be discriminatory. The cumulative effects of bias in the system as a whole have led to intolerably destructive and long-term effects on minority communities. Examples are many. People of color experience statistically higher rates of contact with police, a disproportion that persists even when other factors like age and economic status are taken into account. African American drivers, for example, are more likely than others to have their vehicles searched and to be arrested. And in fact, I have a friend of mine. We were all hanging out in the park. All of us had our cars. Someone called the police on us. I couldn't tell you why. The police came up, interrogated us separately, asked for IDs, but only my friend who was African American had his car searched. Why? There's only one explanation I'm aware of, right? None of us had anything in our cars. None of us had a record. All of us lived locally in the area. We all had similar zip code addresses, right? We all had identification on us. None of us had been doing anything the rest of us weren't doing. And by the way, what we were doing was playing cards. Why? Why was his car searched? And when I realized that his car had been searched and asked him, what did they say? He said, oh, this happens all the time. Okay. Since people of color are disproportionately likely to live in poverty, they are also less likely to be released on bail. Compared to those who are released before trial, detained individuals are statistically more likely to be convicted and to be incarcerated. People of color are thus more likely to have a prior criminal record, which means they will receive harsher punishments for future offenses. Likewise, people of color are more likely than Caucasians to be sentenced to prison even after offense severity and the defendant's criminal record are taken into account. The cumulative effects of racial bias result in gross over-incarceration and punishment of racial minorities. Now, all of this was more or less alluded to in the Statement on Racism, Freed in Christ, Race, Ethnicity, and Culture, where we formally articulated that racism is a sin, a violation of God's intention that fractures and fragments human society, right? Now, the full story of race and criminal justice systems is very, very complex. But one test of the justice of any system is its results. We believe that present criminal justice practices and legislation have produced blatantly unacceptable results with respect to race. Remember, this is 2013, guys. Sorry, folks. I use that generally as a gender-neutral term, but so then, what then? Oh, we're not done. Reentry. Significant challenges and problems continue for offenders following release from prison. Personal obstacles make it difficult to find and retain employment, to maintain healthy personal and familiar relationships. Some of these problems would have been real before incarceration, but many stem from the punishment itself. And legal obstacles make the problem worse. Collateral sanctions are punishments stemming from legislation against those convicted of crimes and include limitations to employment, civic participation, housing, and educational opportunities. The punitive view that underlies the trend towards mass incarceration continues to exercise its holds beyond the prison walls. And we recognize and endorse the important work of providing support and services to those who have been incarcerated and strongly encourage such ministries of accompaniment among the faithful to aid the all-important goal of full integration into society, right? But what have we just said here? What we said is the criminal justice system has no intention of you finish your term and now you're completely restored to normal citizenship. That's not what we do. And we have to then start asking, why? Why was that not the goal? You can tell I'm getting heated about all of this. And then there's immigration detention. Some people point to similarities between a punitive mindset about criminal justice and the current trends in enforcement of immigration laws. The numbers of deportations and the reliance on immigration detention, which is often arbitrary and indefinite, have grown exponentially in recent years. Remember, this is 2013. Okay? Barack Obama was president when this was written. Detention is a severe, under-scrutinized, and expensive method of migration control. Migrants in detention include asylum seekers, survivors of torture, lawful permanent residents, and families with children. Most of these have not committed crimes but are held in county jails or in jail-like facilities, increasingly those operated by private prison corporations while awaiting either court proceedings or deportation. Does it sound familiar? It's just like the criminal justice system and its incarceration of persons who are being held, awaiting trial, or persons who have been convicted. Individuals accused of and detained for immigration violations lack adequate due process and meaningful access to legal counsel. Conditions of confinement are harsh and include solitary confinement and minimal access to visitors. This experience can be re-traumatizing and isolating, particularly for individuals who are locked up far from their families and their communities. The outdated and inadequate U.S. immigration system is highly complex, controversial, and difficult to address in terms of its origin and in terms of solutions. The ELCA, in a social message and a social policy resolution, nevertheless repeatedly has articulated principles for just and wise treatment of immigrants. And that's a separate social message. Consistent with these documents, this church urges arbitrary and indefinite detention and dehumanizing isolation of migrants should be discontinued and the use of humane alternatives expanded, right? 2013, we were calling for an end to detainment of immigrants, right? 2013. It's 2021, and the problem's worse, not better. The ELCA does not presume to have quick or easy prescriptions for any of these enduring, intractable problems. But we do call for a vital and sustained response, right? So for all of you who put away your Black Lives Matter flags or whatever it was you were doing when the protests were erupting for justice around the murder of George Floyd, no, we need to do this consistently. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And so in seeking to respond to these needs, we are drawing on Lutheran resources to explore the nature of Christian understanding and practice, right? So that's section 3 and 4, which we'll cover next time. Inadequate understanding of matters of criminal justice does not depend solely on secular reason. We turn to Scripture for new insight, courage, and strength. We draw on our confessions and historical theological reflection, as well as existing efforts by congregations, social ministry organizations, and others for knowledge and wisdom about what works. And we believe significant improvement in the criminal justice system is urgently necessary, economically advantageous, and possible. This statement seeks to employ the best of human reason as a gift from God. The sections that we'll cover in our third video, 5 through 7, guided by common principles and social science evidence, recommend pathways towards improvement. We remain aware of the naivete that assumes the best intentions always lead to the best results. We know that's not the case. So this guidance is offered in the spirit of discernment and deliberation for public policy, but a spirit insistent that constructive action be taken. So that's the first 2 sections of this statement, articulating the real deep problems in broad strokes that we're talking about in this statement. You can see why it's a lengthy statement and why I've taken so much time with it. Now, it may well be that someone watching this video is very upset. I don't know why. Maybe you're somebody who's experienced the criminal justice system. Maybe you're somebody who works in some relationship to the criminal justice system. Hear me clearly. This is not about vilifying individuals. This is not even about vilifying the former police officer who murdered George Floyd while in the line of duty, although that is actually what happened. Even the criminal justice system agrees with that one. It's not about those kinds of things. It's about asking why these situations keep happening and what we can do about it. It's about understanding how we as Christians are going to relate to the criminal justice system and how we're going to go about critiquing it and what ways we might be able to be a better society in relationship to crime and justice. So I hope that you'll join me for this. This has all been very negative, perhaps, for you. But hopefully tomorrow we'll talk about some theological understandings and we'll get a little bit out of that. And then on the third video, we'll talk about the suggestions the statement makes for changes. So we'll look at that soon. I hope this has been helpful. Drop me a question or a comment below. And until next time, God bless.